Everyone, we have quorum, and so we're going to get started. I call the meeting to order, and I'd like to welcome everyone to meeting number 11 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee is continuing its study of greenhouse gas emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. Today is our 6th of 9 meetings with witnesses for this study. Please note that today we'll be meeting in public to hear our witnesses up until 5 p.m. and then going in camera from 5 to 5:30 for committee business. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person or remotely using the Zoom application. And we ask everybody to note that the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entire committee. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted while we are in session. Today's proceedings will be televised and made available via the House of Commons website. I'd like to begin by welcoming Mr. Keurig, Mr. Bragdon to the committee, and Mr. Morris. It's always good to see you here as well. Today in Ontario, the health and safety protocols changed, but not in the House. And so I've been asked, just as a reminder, that if people are moving about the room in person, they're asked to put a mask on. When seated, members are allowed to take their masks off. And for interventions, people are encouraged but not required to have a mask on when they're not speaking. And then for witnesses and members, here's a few rules to help us have an orderly and efficient meeting. So interpretation services are available for the meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen to choose either floor, which is the language being used real time, English or French. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. For members in the room, same as always, raise your hand if you'd like to speak, and the clerk and I will do our best to keep track of speaking order. And members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. We'll do our best to make sure we're balancing who's in person, who's on screen in the order. Before speaking, wait until I recognize you by name. If you're on Zoom, you'll have to unmute yourself, and then when you're done, please mute yourself in the room. Here, we have our technical staff who will help with the piece. And a reminder, all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. There was something else I wanted to mention on this. For our guests who are here, if you haven't been before committee before, each member has allocated time for their speaking, and they'll usually direct their question to a specific witness. If you have something you'd like to say, you can use the raise hand function, but I let the person asking the questions decide if they're going to involve you in the discussion or not. It's fairly fast-paced, and the members often have specific things they want to get to, and so the time generally is left to them to manage. So that's how the process is going to work. We also have a handy card system here. Well, when you get down to the last 30 seconds, I raise the yellow flag, and when the time's up, I raise the red card, and that's just simply a sign to wrap up your thoughts. You don't have to stop mid-sentence, but wrap up as quickly as possible so we can get on to the next person. So with that, I'd like to welcome our guests for today officially. As individuals, we have Martin Olzinski, Associate Professor, University of Calgary. We have Louis César Pasquier, Associate Professor, Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique. We have Nicholas Rivers, Associate Professor, University of Ottawa, Charles Seguin, Professor, University du Québec à Montréal, and Andrew Weaver, Professor, University of Victoria. And then from the Mikisew Cree First Nation, Melody Lepine, the director, who will be speaking, and then is her assist, Benjamin Say, Manager of Environmental Affairs. And so each of the witnesses will have 5 minutes for your opening statements. And I'll let you know when your time is up with the card system. With that, we'll turn right over to Mr. Olzinski. You can now proceed with your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair and members of this committee. I understand you have all now received a copy of my brief, so in the time allotted to me today, I will just reiterate the main points. I've also managed to watch some of your previous hearings and will address some of the issues that I've seen raised. First, I want to acknowledge Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its tragic and unacceptable toll on the people of Ukraine, but also its emergent influence on energy policy and politics in Canada. Like the vast majority of Canadians, I support economic sanctions and bans on Russian oil and gas. At the same time, the existential threat of climate change remains. Indeed, climate change is widely understood as a threat multiplier. It makes war and conflict more likely. Consequently, in its response to this and future crises, Canada's government must heed the IPCC's most recent warning that further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future. Second, Canada, like other countries, has committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. The question before this committee then is how to get there. More specifically, is an emissions cap on the oil and gas sector necessary or desirable for getting there? You have heard some witnesses say that it is. Others have suggested that existing policy tools could be sufficient if they were made more stringent. I submit to you that the answer depends on your evaluative framework. All policy tools have their strengths and weaknesses. As one example, while carbon pricing may be the most economically efficient, hard emission caps provide more certainty in terms of reductions. Feasibility and legal certainty are also relevant considerations. From my perspective, and considering recent events especially, a hard declining emissions cap is an appropriate additional tool in the federal law and policy toolbox. Third, in terms of constitutionality, in my opinion, Parliament's criminal law power provides the necessary jurisdictional anchor for an emissions cap, one that could take the form of a regulation under SEPA 1999. The Supreme Court of Canada has been clear that Section 9127 of the Constitution Act refers to the criminal law in its widest sense, that it can be used to protect both human health and the environment, and that the exercise of this power is not rendered invalid simply because it affects matters falling within provincial jurisdiction. Fourth, and finally, to the extent that the government appears committed to tax credits for CCS, you need a clearer sense of the ledger here. And this applies equally to the broader conversation about the role of Canadian oil and gas in the world. The facts are these. Despite some improvements over the years, the best available evidence suggests that Canada's oil sands are still amongst the most GHG intensive in the world. Oil sands mining has resulted in the creation of 1.4 trillion liters of toxic tailings. Plans to release oil sands processed water and to reclaim the remaining tailings ponds remain highly uncertain. And the estimated environmental liabilities from all of this range from $34 to $130 billion, for which less than $1 billion has been currently set aside by industry. None of this is to suggest that Canadian oil and gas shouldn't compete in the international markets while they exist. They absolutely should. But there is reason to question further subsidies to the sector, bearing in mind current profits in particular. And with that, I'll end my remarks.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I would also should have mentioned to our witnesses, Mr. Olzinski did a perfect pace. We have translation going on, and so we ask people not to try to pack in as much as you can because it does make it very challenging for the interpreters. So just a nice, casual, conversational speed is appreciated. So thank you. We'll go now to Monsieur Pasquier, and you'll have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames et Messieurs les députés, membres du comité, merci de m'offrir l'opportunité de témoigner aujourd'hui autour de la question d'un plafonnement des émissions de gaz à effet de serre pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier. Chimiste de formation, mes travaux de recherche s'intéressent à l'élaboration de technologies environnementales qui visent la réduction des émissions de GES par la valorisation de matières résiduelles alcalines capables de capter le CO2 dans le but de fournir de nouveaux produits et contribuer à une économie circulaire faible en carbone. Par exemple, je peux prendre des résidus miniers ou des résidus de construction, les faire réagir avec du CO2.
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. The translation is mixed up. We're on the French channel for English. So
Test 1 2, test 1 2. English channel, test 1 2. Test 1 2, English channel. Is that working? Test 1 2.
sorry about that interruption. Please
I can
continue.
hear you now.
Okay.
Are we good? OK. Donc.
For example, I can take mining tailings or construction waste and have them react with CO2 to create high value-added materials and new construction materials. I'm basing my testimony today on this expertise. It's already been mentioned that the 6th report of the IPCC, published a few weeks ago, said very clearly that scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. In the last inventory, the country's emissions in 2019 were down 1.1% below 2005 levels, whereas general emissions were down or stagnating. Those associated with oil and gas and transportation were clearly up. More specifically, oil and gas extraction emissions went from 63 to 105 megatons of CO2 equivalent, for an increase of 40% attributable to the increase of nearly 200 production in oil and gas production, 200%. Reduction in emissions intensity per unit of hydrocarbons is insufficient, and we must target a clear net reduction in emissions. In 2016, the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change was adopted. We are forecasting reduction in oil and gas emissions by 40 to 45% below 2012 levels in 2025, but results demonstrate the emissions are up by 13%. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS, is the technology promoted by sectoral interveners to meet the reduction objectives. This is a technology being used in Canada since 2014. According to the CCUS Institute, roughly 4 megatons of CO2 have been captured in Canada. The CO2 comes from energy, hydrogen production sector, and fertilizers, but only 1.2 megatons are stored. The rest is being used for assisted petroleum recovery, which, to my mind, cancels out any environmental benefits. Currently, no emissions from production or refining of oil and gas is captured or stored in the country. Projects being developed focus on other areas than what we're looking at into today. Only the Edmonton Hub grid mentions petroleum refining in its enlarged emissions portfolio being considered. So clearly CCUS is not the solution to achieve our specific goals for this sector. But CCUS is an important technology for the energy transition required, especially to reduce difficult and reduction sectors such as cement, steel, and bioenergy. CCUS must be separated out from assisted petroleum recovery, which doesn't make sense. CO2 must be stored in geological reservoirs or used as raw material to decarbonate supply chains, including construction materials, chemicals, and fuels such as methanol. Given the too frequent reduction targets that haven't been met in the past and current trends, given the increase in oil and gas net emissions in oil and gas sector in Canada, given the failure of CCUS to reduce oil and gas sector emissions, considering the report of IPCC and the urgency of concrete actions, my recommendations are as follows. 1, to implement an oil and gas cap quickly. This could be progressive, but must clearly make it possible to meet the reduction targets in our Pan-Canadian framework. 2, continue and strengthen carbon pricing to consolidate and stimulate the CO2 market and to increase the pace of clean technology development, such as CCUS, dissociated from the petroleum industry. Engage energy transition by focusing on renewable energy and local energy so that we will no longer depend on fossil fuels and we have greater security for Canadians given the climate and geopolitical tensions, thus providing economic prosperity for all. In other words, today we don't need fossil fuel energy autonomy, but truly low-carbon energy autonomy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pesquet.
To Mr. Rivers, and we'll go to you now for 5 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. According to Environment and Climate Change Canada's most recent national inventory report, the oil and gas sector produces over a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. As high as that value is, it includes only greenhouse gases emitted during production of oil and gas, and not the much larger emissions that are released when the oil and gas are eventually combusted for energy. Moreover, since 2005, emissions from the oil and gas sector have grown faster than those of any other sector, and future growth in emissions from the oil and gas sector threatens the possibility for Canada to achieve its climate change targets. Nevertheless, I do not believe that a new mandatory cap on oil and gas sector emissions is required. Instead, I believe that we can achieve deep cuts in emissions from this and other sectors through continued improvement in existing regulations. To understand my position, it's important to recognize that oil and gas emissions, along with emissions from other large industries, are already regulated under the federal output-based pricing system as well as provincial carbon pricing systems that cover large emitters. A higher carbon price in these systems results in more incentive to reduce emissions. In contrast, the oil and gas cap under consideration would likely be implemented using a cap and trade approach. In this case, an overall emissions cap would be allocated across all oil and gas producers who could trade permits with one another to achieve the cap. Just like the existing OBPS system, companies would determine how much to reduce emissions based on the prevailing price of emissions permits, otherwise known as the carbon price. In other words, at the level of the individual oil and gas producer, the existing system of output-based regulations and the proposed oil and gas cap both provide incentives to reduce emissions via the same mechanism, a carbon price. My basic argument is that we don't need a new sector cap on emissions, since we already have in place a policy that can motivate emissions reductions in exactly the same manner as would occur under this proposed policy. While a sector cap on oil and gas emissions would provide similar incentives to firms as existing regulations, there are two reasons it might be promoted anyway. First, a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector may enable the pursuit of more aggressive emission reductions in this sector than under existing regulations. In my view, however, we should not single out a particular sector for more ambitious emission reductions, which is a costly way to achieve our environmental goals, but instead seek to generate more emissions reductions from across all sectors. This can be done by strengthening our existing cross-sectoral regulations. The second reason a cap on oil and gas might be promoted is that it may provide more certainty of achieving a given emission reduction target in the oil and gas sector. This is true in theory, although in practice, cap and trade systems typically contain provisions like compliance flexibility or credit banking that reduce the certainty that a particular emission target is reached in any given year. There is, in other words, little to be gained from introducing a new cap on the oil and gas sector that cannot already be achieved by strengthening the existing output-based regulatory system for large industry. And while there is little to be gained, there is a cost associated with introducing a sector cap on oil and gas emissions. First, there's an administrative cost. Setting up a new cap and trade system for the oil and gas sector would require new regulatory resources, and there is no guarantee that it could be implemented quickly. With increased climate ambition, there are many demands on regulators, and regulatory time could be better spent. Second, there is a cost associated with concentrating emission reductions in the oil and gas sector rather than spreading them across all sectors, as under the current output-based regulations. And third, concentrating emissions reductions in one regionally concentrated sector could increase political division associated with climate policy. Overall, I see little reason to introduce a new cap on oil and gas emissions. Instead, to more quickly reduce oil and gas emissions, I recommend that the federal government continue to revise and strengthen the output-based regulations that reduce emissions both in the oil and gas sector as well as other sectors. Two actions are most critical. First, the federal government should develop output-based benchmarks and prices that are consistent with 2030 and 2050 emission reduction targets. By 2050, emissions intensity benchmarks should reach zero across all regulated sectors with limited compliance flexibility. Effectively, this implies a hard cap of zero on all industrial emissions by 2050, not just oil and gas emissions. Second, the federal government should increase efforts to ensure that provincial large emitter carbon pricing policies achieve the same emission reductions as the federal benchmark. In sum, the proposed cap on oil and gas emissions is unnecessary. Instead, the focus should be on increasing the ambition of our existing regulations for all large emitters. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that. And now we'll move to Monsieur Seguin. Monsieur Seguin, vous avez 5 minutes.
Mr. Seguin, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, it's a great pleasure and with some humility that I'm presenting my reflections on an oil and gas emissions cap to you today. My in-depth knowledge of the Quebec cap and trade system and the economic literature on the control of polluting emissions have shaped my point of view. It's necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate climate change, but it's also costly for whoever does this. This interplay between cost and benefit means that a gradual reduction over time is necessary. Based on the cost, different emitters should reduce their emissions at different rates. Those for whom it's least costly should act most quickly, and those for whom it's most costly should proceed more slowly. The question of reducing emissions costs is particularly significant in the context of climate change. Alone, Canada cannot hope to significantly impact the trajectory of the planet's climate, because we only represent 2% of global emissions. One of the means we have to bring other countries in our wake is to demonstrate that it's possible to reduce emissions by still having a robust economy. But to do this, it's best to reduce emissions at the lowest possible cost. Ideally, regulations would send a common signal to all greenhouse gas emitters and would let market forces determine the pace of reductions for each of the economy's sectors. Current regulations in Canada are far from this ideal. We could even qualify our regulations as Byzantine. Several stakeholders have already mentioned to this committee the risk that any new regulatory burden would pose. I share their concerns, at least several of them. However, I'd like to use my times before this committee to point out certain considerations which are important to proceed when we think about introducing any emissions cap for oil and gas. The approach is imperfect, but at least it leaves room for regulatory choices, which could be more or less efficient. I have 5 elements to mention. First, a cap can only be implemented if emissions can be measured properly. In the oil and gas sectors, emissions are not well measured, especially fugitive emissions. It's essential to have an accurate measure of a sector's emissions before we implement any cap. Secondly, it's important for a cap to be associated with exchangeable, tradable permits so that we send a cost signal that's clear to emitters through the price of these permits, and we have to allow emitters to trade these permits to reduce the overall cost of meeting the requirements of the cap. Third, the oil and gas sector has to be faced with the marginal cost of reducing its emissions that's not significantly different, either higher or lower, than that of other sectors of the economy. One way of achieving this is to impose a CATS system on the price of the permits. We can have a floor price and a ceiling price, which could change in tandem with the federal carbon tax. So we could create a virtual connection between the regulated sector and the other emitters in the economy, which would avoid having overly significant differences in the carbon pricing between sectors. Fourth, a system that would only apply to the oil and gas sector would have to cover the broadest possible proportion of emissions in the sector. The broadest coverage would provide for better liquidity in the secondary permit market, which would increase its value. A market with too few players could suffer from a lack of competition in buying and trading permits, which would then falsify their pricing. And to correct the situation, it would be a good idea to open the allocation of permits to others, to investors, maybe at auction, so not just to greenhouse gas emitters of the sector. Fifth, we have to recognize that the oil and gas sector is exposed to the risk of leakage abroad, which is particularly current in the way that the OPEC countries have reacted and increased their production. To reduce this leakage, emitters should be given permits corresponding with the fraction of their historical emissions. These 5 elements are all complex. The federal government could benefit from Quebec's experience with its cap-and-trade system. It includes the elements that I've mentioned, particularly a floor price, the participation of investors to permit auctions, and a dynamic allocation system for permits. I would like to remind you that simply implementing as an oil and gas sector emissions cap does not guarantee success. The ceiling could be useless if too high, or needlessly costly if not well connected with the rest of the emitters and the other emitting sectors of greenhouse gases. The devil is in the details, and we have to avoid having these. We have to make sure that these details are appropriately identified to avoid the many pitfalls. Thank you.
We'll now move to my home, beautiful province of British Columbia, to Mr. Weaver, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Weaver for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. It's an enormous honor for me to be here. I'm speaking to you as both a scientist who's been working in the field as a climate scientist since the late 80s. I served as a lead author in the 2nd IPCC assessment, the 3rd IPCC assessment, the 4th IPCC assessment, and the 5th IPCC assessment, and numerous other international committees. Like you, I have some experience also in political decision-making, having served as the leader of the BC Green Party, holding the balance of power in a minority government in British Columbia when we put in place Clean BC, the policy plan in British Columbia. I'm speaking to you largely as a climate scientist today, and I want to emphasize some of the historical misconceptions with respect to the carbon cycle, as well as emissions reductions or lack thereof in Canada. We all know, for example, that you around the table, the decision makers of today, have very difficult decisions to make. Yet the irony is you will never have to live the consequences of the decisions you made. For the warming we have and the climate change we have over the next decade or so, next couple of decades, your political lifetime is in essence in the cards as a direct consequence of inertia in our socioeconomic systems. However, the decisions you make today will have a profound effect on the future generations who are not here to be part of the decision-making process. And so fundamentally, the question is, do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, you have no choice but to implement bold action today. For failing to do so will lead us to a planet that frankly is in a lot of strife. The two biggest issues, of course, are geopolitical instability associated with the rapidly changing climate for which our built environment cannot adapt, and widespread species extinction, which is ongoing as we speak. Coming to Canada, many people will say that Canada is, 2% of the global emissions or a small player. In actual fact, Canada is the 11th greatest emitter as a nation in the world, behind countries like China, India, United States, Germany, Iran, South Korea, ahead of countries like South Africa, Brazil, and many, many others. Per capita, Canada is, if not the worst, one of the worst developed nations. And I'm not counting small petro-states like Qatar or Palau, but in terms of nations. But what is also often not understood in the political decision-making process, it is not the emissions in any given year that matter. The climate system and its response reflects cumulative emissions since pre-industrial times. And in a cumulative sense, Canada is the 8th biggest emitter ever. Canada's emissions since pre-industrial times are on par with those of India, which has a population of greater than 38 times our nation's size. And so we cannot, as a developed nation, for which we have historically created the problem, point to others and say, well, you know, we'll only do this if you do. Because the problem that exists today, those cumulative emissions are ours and other parts of the developed world. Many have thought that the Kyoto Protocol was somehow a failure. I'm speaking to you also to suggest that the Kyoto Protocol, put in place in 1997, was a resounding success. It was a resounding success despite Canada. Canada, as you know, joined the Kyoto Protocol and then pulled out of it. But collectively, the Annex B nations, even if you included Canada and the US pulling out, had emissions go 9.9% below 1990 levels when averaged over the 28 to 2012 period. And the Kyoto Protocol was targeting 6%, 5.2% rather, reductions globally. Some countries, like the UK, had averaged over 28 to 2012, emissions 24% below 1990 levels. Canada's, shamefully, were 16% above 1990 levels. But as I mentioned, even with Canada and the US included, the Kyoto target was met. If Canada and the US are excluded, the Kyoto target was met by more than 20% reductions from 1990 levels, averaged over 2008 to 2012. We know where emissions are coming from in Canada. We know the single biggest province of emitters is Alberta and Saskatchewan, and we know which sectors those emissions are coming from. We have per capita emissions. We know exactly where those sectors are, and we cannot ignore said sectors or give preferential treatment to said sectors. Finally, in terms of further negotiations moving forward, it's absolutely critical that the notion of border tax adjustments also be put on the table, and perhaps a global carbon price to ensure that jurisdictions that show leadership are not left behind economically by being penalized by others in various sectors. And with that, I'll stop and summarize finally by saying there is nothing stopping preventing a cap and trade and carbon pricing being put in. In fact, in British Columbia, when we introduced the first carbon price in Canada back in the 2008-2009 era, we actually had enabling carbon tax legislation there as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Weaver. And now for the final opening statements before we get into our rounds of questions is Ms. Lapine. Ms. Lapine, over to you for your 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melody Lapine, and I'm a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. I'm joining you all from Treaty 8 territory in northeastern Alberta, my ancestral homelands of the Cree and Dene and my Métis relatives. I'll just introduce the Mikisew Cree First Nation. We're one of 5 First Nations in this region. Are basically heavily impacted by oil sands development. My key position with the Mikisew Cree is the Director for Government and Industry Relations. So I oversee the interaction with not only oil sands developers, but also policy and regulators such as the federal government. And this is an important policy being developed to address a significant impact of climate change. The Mikisew Cree, I'll talk a little bit about our territory. We come from the Wood Buffalo National Park, also a World UNESCO Heritage Site, one of the world's largest freshwater deltas. And significant impacts of climate change have been felt and seen over decades. This is not new, I think, to the federal government and provincial government, as we participated in numerous joint federal and provincial hearings, raising impacts of not only climate change, but direct impacts from oil sands development, including cumulative effects, such as impacts to our way of life, our rights, our culture, and the loss and decline of important key species such as boreal caribou, medicinal plants, and most importantly, ability for us to access our traditional lands as we witness the drying of one of the world's largest freshwater deltas, the Peace Athabasca Delta. Our submission was shared with the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and really highlighting some of our concerns about carbon capture, mainly because we feel that more can be done in terms of addressing climate change in developing policy and legislation. Not only looking at reducing emissions, but there are other ways to introduce things such as addressing climate change, perhaps through emissions cap. So some of the additional things I would add is that if the federal government is only going to look at carbon capture as one example, how does something like that address loss of biodiversity? How does it address the tailings issue and potential release of tailings? And so for us, when we look at things, we look at it from a much broader cumulative nature. And so is there an opportunity to address things like impacts to our treaty rights, things to address impacts to cumulative effects, to tailings treatment, to loss of biodiversity, to a potential listing of a World Heritage Site, to an endangered listing. And so there are many other factors to consider when looking at this. The Mikisew Cree have called for reductions in issues of being addressed to deal with climate change. Many of you know that we are dealing with significant impacts from oil sands development, but climate change is really exacerbating things. We are a small, remote community. Tomorrow, our ice road closes, and it's not only a food security issue in getting goods to our fly-in remote community, but also that the duration for us to commute and travel to our community is diminishing. I will also add that it's not only a safety issue. We've had 2016 wildfire here. We've had floods in this area. And so we're also seeing unforeseen impacts such as those events happen more frequently. I guess my overall ask is that there is an opportunity here to protect treaty rights, our treaty rights. There's an opportunity here to protect our way of life and deal with cumulative impacts, deal with loss in biodiversity, such as the woodland caribou, which are really deteriorating before our eyes. We went from a 50% reduction in population of caribou likely due to impacts of oil sands development, but also impacts from climate change. So is there a way to address all of these things in one way? Yes, that's by dealing with climate change and effective policy to reduce emissions and putting an emissions cap in place as one of the ways. So with that, I'll just summarize and thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Great, thank you to each of you for your opening comments, and I think it sets a stage for a very good conversation today. Up first, we have Mr. Melillo for 6 minutes in this first round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and allow me to thank all of the witnesses for joining us today to be a part of this this very important discussion. And I'd like to start with Ms. Lapine, if I can. A lot of very important testimony and very important insights so far. And I suppose I'll start with a question around not just the oil and gas sector, but industry more broadly. There's been some discussion at the committee previously. Given the urgency of the issue we're dealing with, being climate change, would you suggest that when we are investigating a potential emissions cap on the oil and gas sector, should there be a discussion about perhaps not the same cap, but a similar cap being imposed on other industries such as concrete or other industries across the country?
In addition to oil sands, are you asking?
Yes, yeah, for really all industries.
I really don't know the answer to that. I would look to my colleagues or the others on the panel, but I would say, yeah, anything to reduce emissions, I think, is a good thing. That's the goal. So if it could be applied elsewhere, then I would assume yes.
Okay. Yeah, I certainly appreciate that, and I know it's I don't. I just say I know we don't expect all the witnesses to have all the answers, but of course, I think we're on the same page where obviously it's important that the energy sector and the oil and gas sector continues to innovate and continues to find greener ways of doing things. But I just wanted to make the point that I think there's an opportunity in this discussion to talk about industry in Canada more broadly. I'd like to ask, I guess, a bit more of a personal, for lack of a better term, question about your community. So I represent the Kenora riding in northwestern Ontario, which touches treaties 3, 5, and 9. And I know that there's a real sense of community in the First Nations I represent. I think perhaps more so than any other communities in my riding. Obviously, with the importance of traditional land and traditional practices, given that the oil and gas sector specifically employs many First Nation and Indigenous people in Alberta, would there be any concern from your point of view that if there is an emissions cap that were to impact production specifically and actually lead to some job losses, and if the transition is not executed in a seamless way, that there would be people that have to actually leave their community for work and actually lose out on some of those cultural and community aspects of staying in their community?
No, great question. There has to be a transition framework, I think, especially for us northern, isolated Indigenous communities. It's not fair to allow us to become highly dependent on an oil and gas sector and then all of a sudden shut the lights off and expect us to sustain. So there has to be a transition plan, diversification. We have a lot other great resources in our region beyond oil sands. And so this is where we look to the federal government for support to allow us to become active stewards within our territory, that we can continue to sustain our economic and Indigenous cultural way of life. So I think it's a balance, and definitely seek, I guess, that support for this transition.
Thank you. And you mentioned as well the importance of treaty rights in your opening remarks, and I think that's a very important aspect of this. conversation as well in previous meetings. We've talked a lot about the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and really around consultation and consent. And I'd like to ask a question to you if you believe that because so many Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are impacted by the oil and gas sector, do you believe that the government would need to seek the consent of Indigenous communities before moving forward on a policy like an emissions cap?
I think because there's going to be an impact on our rights, our way of life, then most definitely, I think seeking our consent, because we need to understand what impacts there are to our rights. We need to minimize and, if at all possible, avoid those impacts. It's protected under our Constitution, and any means where the government's going to make a decision that may impact those rights, then you must consider seek our consent, that we understand what those impacts are. And consent may be a variety of different things. It could include ways where we can work with you to address those impacts and where we are able to avoid those impacts altogether. So anyway, long answer, but I think you get my point.
No, I certainly appreciate that, and I know that I don't have much time left, so I'll give it back to the chair.
Did you want Mr. Say to weigh in? Just,
oh, sorry, yeah, I didn't see the hand. Absolutely.
I just wanted to add, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add that also there's another factor that needs to be considered, which is future reclamation work and treatment of potential treatment of tailings going forward. Any cap has to factor those in because those are in the interest of the people as well.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We're going to move now to Ms. Jones, and or to you, Ms. Jones, for 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking to you today from my riding in Labrador in Eastern Canada, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Inuit and the Innu people of Labrador. I'd like to first of all thank you for your expertise and for the work that you do every day around this important topic of climate reducing climate carbon reduction and emissions. Education of Canadians is very critical in the work we need to do together to move forward and to be able to transition from fossil fuels. So I appreciate your expertise and testimony. First, I'm going to start with Mr. Seguin. When you presented today, you talked about 5 requirements that you felt should be implemented. And when we've been hearing testimony from witnesses as it related to a possible cap on emissions and focusing on a decrease in emissions rather than a decrease in production. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be around this, or if you would have some recommendations that you'd like to propose on those 2 things.
Thank you for your question. I think if what we're trying to achieve here is decreasing GHG emissions, then that's what the cap should be on. There's different possibilities of decoupling production from emissions. It's not certain at this moment if these possibilities will be economic in the long term. So it's possible that at some point decreasing emissions will necessarily be decreasing production as well. But it'll be better to leave that flexibility to the private sector to see whether they can manage the production with the cap on emissions rather than the cap on production. But that relates to my comment on the accurate measurement of these emissions, because of course, if things are not well measured, then you might want to have the cap on something that's easier to measure. And of course, the production is easier to measure than the emissions.
My second question is for Mr. Rivers. Over the last several meetings that we've held on this study, we heard from witnesses for both direct carbon pricing and cap and trade as tools for possible options. In your opinion, what would be the most effective approach to an emissions cap on this particular sector, and why would you think that way?
Thanks very much for your question. I think you're right to point out that carbon pricing comes in different flavors. So one flavor of carbon pricing is a carbon tax, and another flavor of carbon pricing is a cap and trade system, and another flavor of carbon pricing, which we currently have in place in Canada, is some sort of tradable performance standard. These are all quite similar. They all provide incentives to industry to reduce emissions based on the level of the carbon price. I think that there's actually fairly minimal differences between these systems. The main difference will be determined by the level of the carbon price in any of these systems. And so my contention is that the existing carbon pricing system doesn't need to be replaced with another carbon pricing system implemented through cap and trade, that we have the tools to mandate deep reductions and generate deep reductions in oil and gas and other sectors through the existing system of carbon pricing that's already in place. We don't need another type of system. I think there's relatively minimal differences between these systems.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm also like to ask a question of Ms. Lapine. I know that in your area, not unlike a lot of communities that I represent, many First Nation areas across Canada are heavily dependent upon fossil fuels for electricity, and many of the companies that are operating there are the same. When we talk about implementing a cap or reducing the dependency on these fossil fuels, what recommendations would you have for the government, and how we work with Indigenous communities to do a full transition off fossil fuels, because we know that many of them are highly dependent upon that source right now?
Yeah, we're actually one of them. All of my family's homes in Fort Chipewyan are heating our homes with diesel fuel. We also just last year announced the largest solar farm in Northern Canada. So it's those kinds of success stories that we need to see, more support from the federal government to transition us again into these renewables. It was a great day when we opened up the solar farm. But yes, are there other means? Is there geothermal? Is there I don't have all the answers, but we need to look at those, because I tell you, when our ice road is gone, we have no way to heat our homes. There's no way to truck in fuel, as well as other necessities in our community.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Awesome. Thank you. Unfortunately, Mr. Weaver, we're out of time on that round. So we're going to move now to Monsieur Simard. Monsieur Simard, vous avez 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question for Mr. Pesquier. I think that in his presentation it was quite clear that in his mind the carbon capture and storage strategies were not the solution for the oil and gas sector. I'm not sure if he's aware of this, but the Minister of the Environment has announced that he wanted to end the inefficient subsidies by 2023. And he's used that term. He's talked about the lack of effectiveness or inefficiency. And I wonder whether he thinks that the government support offered by the federal government to implement the CCUS is a form of inefficient grants. What's the question? Thank you for the question, Chair. For me, CCUS is not an option for the technological solutions we could use for the transition. I do believe that CCUS should not prevent us and take us away from our appetite for fossil fuels. We have to really decouple the two. We do need carbon capture and use strategies and to be able to use CO2 not as garbage, but as something with value added. I think that perhaps it would be better to put our money towards helping the population be able to effect the energy transition rather than giving industry the means to continue. Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps I could go back to Mr. Séguin on this, because in his presentation, he said something that struck me. He talked about reducing emissions at the lowest possible cost. So reducing emissions at the lowest possible cost. I know that there are two major projects for CCUS in Alberta, which will cost $2.5 billion. 57% of that amount is being provided by public funds. So my question that I'm asking, and I have been asking since the beginning of this study, is this. Are the carbon capture strategies profitable for industry, or is it inevitable that the government is going to have to pick up the tab for these carbon capture strategies? Thank you for the question. It's rather difficult to say at this time, because the assessment of cost and the degree of cost is over time. So if these technologies were to become highly efficient in the future, maybe the current amounts being devoted will not seem to be so significant, but we can't know that now. Governments are not always best placed to identify the best technologies to develop for future use. You know, when you have an explicit carbon price, you have carbon pricing, which is an incentive to develop technologies. It's not necessarily enough, but that should be the main channel. In other words, pricing to act as an incentive for technology rather than subsidies, because the government can't really know which alternative is going to be the best one to subsidize. So if I've understood you correctly, the more effective or efficient tool would be carbon pricing. That would be the most efficient tool that we've got? Yes, I agree with that statement. Mr. Pasquier, I'd like to hear what you have to say on what I've just talked about. Your knowledge about carbon capture and storage. When it comes to large volumes, let's say, for example, if we look at the entire oil and gas industry, we're talking about enormous volumes. When it comes to such large volumes, is it possible to apply this kind of technology? Yes, it's possible. It's even desirable for this kind of industry or technology. It's easier to get CO2 when it's at a source rather than chasing it when it has to be moved. So from an investment point of view, it's more attractive to invest in a plant which will enable a large volume of carbon dioxide capture rather than small volumes. So if you're looking at the cost per ton of CO2 capture today, if you're talking about CO2 into the ambient air, we're talking about $600 a ton, whereas we're talking about $50 to $100 for more concentrated emissions. Just to be clear, a question for Mr. Pasquier and Mr. Séguin. Without government support, without the financial support of the government, whether it be in the form of tax credits or grants, do you think the oil and gas sector could self-regulate to be able to reduce emissions? Or do you think it's necessary to have money from the public coffers? What bothers me is the primary principle in ecology, which is usually polluter pays rather than polluter gets paid. But it seems to me that in the Canadian strategy, the reverse logic is being applied. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. I'm not sure who's supposed to go first. Well, with Ms. Lepine said, there are communities which are quite remote, so you can't just stop everything all at once. So to get back to my colleague's example, and move towards solutions that are easier to implement and then not leave anyone behind. Well, in the medium term, it's difficult to forecast the future. So government regulations on emissions may lead to a future where the oil and gas is still going to be used, or maybe in the future we will see substitutions and the use of other sources of energy. It's likely that at some point there'll be a lot of substitutions, but at which point we don't know. So it's in the industry's interest to have grants, of course. I don't think that should be the main goal, But we have to recognize that there are communities that depend on these sectors. But with pricing, you provide incentives to business in considering the elements that I've already mentioned. Thank you.
Mr. Angus, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madame Lapine, I'm so glad that you were here. I'm going to ask a number of questions because I'm trying to get a picture that we can get for our committee to understand some of the impacts. I come from Treaty 9, a little bit east of Treaty 8. I'm no stranger to tailings ponds. We call them slimes back home. Kids played on them. There's one pretty close to my house. But I'm trying to get a picture of just how big the tailings ponds are from the oil sands. One example I had of 1.4 trillion liters of water was if you took 560,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools and ran them from Fort Mac back to Australia and back again, that would be the amount of water. Or you could fit 2 cities of Vancouver in the tailings ponds that exist now at Fort Mac and the oil sands operations to the north. Where does that water come from?
A good question. It comes from our Athabasca River, which is actually declining in flow and inhibiting us from navigating and using our watersheds.
Right. So
and it directly flows all the way down to the Peace Athabasca Delta.
To the Peace Athabasca Delta. So we know the famous story of the 1,600 birds that died as they were migrating and they made the mistake of stopping at Syncrude for a visit. But since then, we've had multiple bird die off. So would you tell me that this water isn't really the most benign water on the planet if birds just coming over it and stepping down die en masse?
Oh, absolutely. What's within those tailings ponds is highly toxic.
I was reading what's in those tailings ponds: benzene, toluene, hydrocarbons, creosote, cadmium, arsenic. I dealt with benzenes, hydrocarbon, toluene in the community of Attawapiskat and the cancers it caused in children. And that site was minuscule compared to what's in these sites. Have you found, and we've heard reports of elevated cancer in Fort Chip and other communities?
Yes.
Yes. And we have reports that these ponds are leaking?
Yes, that's correct. I believe the federal government has reports that verify that, and it was part of an investigation, I believe, under, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's part of, the name strikes me right now. There was a commission that was looking at that not too long ago.
I'm asking this because in 5 years, the Trudeau government gave over $100 billion in subsidies to big oil. Now, these subsidies are tax write-offs, incentives, grants, direct monies, but we don't talk about the subsidies that are given in the taking of your land and your water. Because am I correct that it takes 4 to 6 barrels of water from the Athabasca to make 1 barrel of bitumen?
That's roughly the amount. Yeah, it could be 3 to 4 barrels. But yes, they do a lot. They use a lot of water.
They don't pay for that water.
No, and they don't return it. They're looking to return it with this treatment and release technology that has not been developed yet.
So I guess I want to ask about that then, because, we keep hearing this concept, polluter pays, and everyone says polluter pays, and we look after this. But we're looking, according to the Canadian Energy Regulator, at a million barrel increase a year in the coming years. So that's going to increase a massive amount of pressure on the Athabasca rivers, which going to put the Athabasca River, which will put an enormous pressure on the tailings. And the solution that we're being told from industry is, well, just let us dump it and we'll make it all a lot better for you. Do you believe that before that water is dumped in any capacity that it has to be restored, reclaimed, and made safe so that it is no threat to people, to the wildlife, and to the fragile ecosystem of Athabasca and the Mackenzie Delta?
Absolutely. We take the position as zero risk and zero liability, not only today, but for the future.
I'm asking that because, you know, I was reading the thing about the Mining Association. So they have the obligation, which is same in my region of Treaty 9. They have to restore the land. They say they will restore the land back to nature. And their argument is, well, there's all this, quote, the more water that's stored on site, the less of the site itself is able to be reclaimed until there's an opportunity to release that water and free up space, as though by allowing them to pump all this cadmium and toluene and benzenes into the water will allow them to do the job of reclaiming the land. Shouldn't they have to reclaim the water first and foremost before any of that is released, or should any of it be released without guarantees?
None of it should be released.
Okay.
And reclamation, I mean, yeah, no, they promised reclamation 40 years ago when they started mining.
So I'm going to end on this then, because they are making record profits. They've asked the Canadian government to give them $75 billion for carbon capture. They're making money hand over fist right now. They're going to look at 1 million barrel a year increase in production. Wouldn't it be just reasonable to say, whoa, 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 before you do any increase, we want to know what you're going to do to protect the water, how you're going to deal with the damage that you've done, and how you're going to ensure that any new water going forward will be returned in a manner that is protecting the environment, protecting the people, and protecting the rights of the Cree, Dene, and Métis people of the region.
I say just a brief response to that, and then we'll move on to our next questioner.
No, that is our goal, Mr. Angus, is to protect treaty, the ecological health of our region, including one of the world's largest freshwater deltas, a world UNESCO site, Canada's largest national park, and really important to me is the health of the people. We have some of the highest rates of cancer and diseases that are not known to many places in Canada in our community.
Well, thank you for that, and I would love to come and visit at some point.
So we're going to go next to Mr. Bragdon, and if you're ready, and in this round we have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to defer my slot to my colleague, Mr. McGuire. We're just changing spots here. So thank you very much.
Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses today for their testimony. I just wanted to follow up on a bit of that with you, Ms. Lapine. And your Mikisew, your Cree First Nation has been one of the leaders in oil sands partner specializing in the construction, the maintenance, servicing, and logistics in the field. The Liberal government is looking at introducing an action plan to implement UNDRIP. And do you see any challenges with the government imposing an emissions cap on Indigenous-led energy projects?
No, I don't think so. I can't think of any right now.
Great, thank you. I think it's vital that First Nations be economically independent. And as we've heard from previous witnesses in this study, natural resource projects are an excellent way to accomplish this through employment and partnerships. If the oil and gas production does go down, how would this impact the Indigenous jobs in your sector, in your communities?
Well, there could definitely be, I think, job loss for sure. There is a lot of employment and economic opportunities provided by the oil and gas sector. And that's why we are asking for a transition. We had a very vibrant economy well before oil sands. And so we would like to look at solutions to other alternatives in our economic well-being. I don't think the answer is being dependent on one natural resource sector. First Nations can thrive in many different economic opportunities within natural resources, within community sustainability initiatives, such as tourism, protecting culture. I mean, I mentioned we're within Canada's largest national park. There are many opportunities for economic sustainability within that resource, as an example.
And I'll give you a chance to expand on that here, because when the government is looking at designing an emissions cap, would it be the best way for them to support the Indigenous partnerships?
I think adaptation, transition, seeking ways to find alternatives, seeking ways to transition, not allowing small Indigenous communities to be solely dependent on one sector, and basically putting all of our eggs in one basket where we have to sacrifice so many other things just to solely be dependent on one thing.
Yeah, thanks. There's a study out, the McDonald-Laurier Institute report, and according to it, the oil and gas and mining sectors represent about 8 of the top 10 highest paying occupations for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So how would the Indigenous peoples be affected economically if oil and gas production decline? There's one thing to lose jobs, but of course there's an economic impact as well. You've got a lot of investment there, as I understand as well.
I think there could, a lot more research and studies could be looking at economic, the new buzzword I'm hearing today is economic reconciliation. And what does that mean? And so exploring that notion of economic reconciliation could mean the presentation of untapped economic opportunities that may not have been considered before a lot of the more traditional practices of today.
Yeah, I heard your comment earlier about, it's just not fair to start a development like that and then shut it down. It does impact the lives of a lot of people. And I had the opportunity of being in Fort Mac about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, in regards to looking at the types of reclamation that was going on there, which is pretty tremendous. There's change there, there's no doubt about it. And they've used a lot less water now than they did 10, 15 years ago in that process. But I thank you for your comments in regards to the impacts. I just want to switch to Mr. Rivers for a minute. And, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices put out a report this month outlining the framework of Canada's emissions reductions plan, in which you're acknowledged as a reviewer. You are. It's a key observation that, quote, global oil prices are one of the major determinants of the oil and gas sector's output, and therefore its emissions. Since international oil prices are beyond Canada's control, and given the oil and gas sector's large share of national emissions, policies in all sectors should be flexible and adaptable enough to respond to changing global conditions, end quote. So given the current events, do you think this statement should make the government pause and think before establishing an emissions cap?
I'm just going to say, if you can answer that very briefly, we've run out of time, so it doesn't do you much justice, but briefly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Right. Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I would emphasize that the social costs of oil and gas are consistent regardless of the international context. So I think we want to be designing our institutions and policies around oil and gas for the long term. And of course, we want to be thinking about the day-to-day events, but we want to be designing these policies to reduce emissions over the half century to century frame.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we're going to go to Mr. Shahal. So you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony today. I want to start with Monsieur Pasquet. He talked a little bit about the role of CCUS and the importance of the technology. Monsieur Pasquet, do you believe that CCUS is an important technology, and the government's role in supporting emerging technologies?
So short answer is yes. CCUS is an important technology, but it's not the only one technology. It should be amongst a lot of solutions. And for more, it should not be the reason that we actually don't make the changes that we need to do regarding our use of fossil fuels and the energy in general.
So you do believe it's an important technology, and we should look at this technology and other technologies in reducing emissions?
Yeah. To put more in context, I've been in this field for more than 10 years, and the evolution is very slow. I would say that before the Sask Power capture plant was started, people were thinking that that's the solution. We have the solution for clean energy, clean oil and gas. But the fact is that today it's not the case. But the other side, in Europe, the price on carbon is pushing a lot of new projects that put CCS or CCU in front. So my conclusions or my observations is the energy and more specifically the oil and gas sector has its chance and is yet not on the target regarding the use of CCUS.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pasquet, and for your comments. Mr. Sagan, you talked about carbon or leakage of oil and gas abroad. How could Canada work with key trading partners like the United States in developing carbon adjustments?
I'm not sure what is being referred to. Is it carbon border adjustments? Or,
correct.
Yes. Okay.
Carbon border adjustments.
Good. The big challenge here will be moving from regulation that targets facilities to regulation that targets the product, because the facilities don't move, but the products get traded, right? In oil and gas, it's probably a little bit easier because projects are more homogeneous. So if we would want to work that out with the United States, we would have to agree on a common measurement, because the oil and gas flow both ways across the border, right? So we would want the price to be applied the same way. It would be more difficult because the Americans right now, I don't know if they have Canada a lot in mind. They have Europe a lot in mind, which is more advanced on carbon border adjustments, and they want non-price measures to be taken into account into the tariff that would be put at the border. But it's very hard to evaluate the monetary impact of these non-price measures because they're kind of imperfectly translating into the price of the different products. So it's very challenging, and I think it won't come to be implemented until many years.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights on that. And I'm going to go to Mr. Rivers. Mr. Rivers, what role do you believe natural gas should have in helping us transition to net zero?
Thanks for your question. I think, that's a really difficult question, and I think there's not a clear answer for that from the academic community. It's clear that gas has a lower carbon footprint per unit of energy than coal or oil. So from that perspective, there's potentially some opportunity. And historically, I think that's what we've thought. There have been extraordinarily rapid improvements in renewable technologies in the last decade, however, and I think that's leading a lot of people to rethink their conception of natural gas as a bridge fuel. It looks like we may be able to leapfrog over gas in many contexts rather than have to step through gas because of how fast renewable technologies have developed. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Do we have enough renewable?
We're out of time on that one now, so we're going to move on and with regrets. And Mr. Simard, it's over to you for 2.5 minutes.
Vous passez avec regret à Monsieur Simard.
So you move on to Mr. Simard with regrets? It sounded funny in French. Perhaps in your presentation, Mr. Rosinski, you implied that the intensity of the tar sands has increased. I have a fear, and that's regarding the willingness to use CCUS to increase production. Because we're not talking about any cap on production, but we're talking about an emissions cap. So I'm getting the impression that actually what people are trying to do today is make oil more acceptable in connection with the current climate crisis, and make oil more acceptable would mean using a lot of public money. And I would like to hear what you have to say about this, if you have anything to say.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
What I would say is that insofar as the federal government is concerned, it's the totality of emissions that we're concerned with. And here we're talking about roughly 26% of Canada's national emissions, right? And so, I think the position has to be both practically, but also from a constitutional one. If oil can be produced more effectively, efficiently, resulting in lesser GHGs, then there should be no problem with producing that oil. The concern that we have, the evil that we are concerned with, is rising GHG emissions and their impact on the climate. And so, my understanding, and this is certainly more of a technical issue outside of my wheelhouse, but that there are efficiency gains to be made, that we could make significant gains, or not insignificant anyways, gains in efficiency and reduce emissions through to 2030 without CCS even. And then from that point on, moving forward, that if CCS is feasible and works, then there may be further gains to be had. And so it really, from a law and policy perspective, we say that's your motive, that's your sort of driver there. The cap would simply say very clearly that absolute emissions have to stay at that cap, and then over time that cap is going to decline. So I don't know. It does go beyond. We're not just talking about an intensity-based emissions cap. We are talking about an absolute cap on emissions here for the sector, and so it would drive that innovation. It would drive those investments, and what we would see, and what the companies have all committed to, right, is a net zero pathway by 2050. So whether it can be used to greenwash oil, at the end of the day, we know that the emissions, downstream emissions, the emissions, Scope 3 emissions from our vehicles and from other processes, those have to be dealt with for sure. And so this is really just sort of I think an interim sort of step. So long as oil is being used, can we make Canadian oil and gas drive down its emissions so that it is more competitive, frankly, in a low carbon scenario.
Yeah, we're out of time there. We're going to move right into Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Olszynski. I just want to follow up on my colleague because one of the things that we've been hearing here is that we can, Canada's energy regulator is planning for a massive increase in production, 1 million barrels a day. Certainly, even before the war in Ukraine, they were looking to promote that for export. And it would be theoretically possible for us to be at net zero with a massive increase because none of the emissions from this 1 million barrels a day is going to be counted because it's burned offshore. Is that logical?
Well, I guess I think it's baked into the system that we're dealing with, both internationally and domestically. I had a chance to quickly review the Net Zero Advisory Board's report submissions to the government today, and that same perspective is shared there. So I think, what I think it just does is just makes clear that overall here, this isn't a panacea. We are driving and need to drive towards decarbonization of our economies. We need to move in that direction as hard and fast as possible. If in the interim, the oil and gas industry sees it fit to invest in these technologies so that it can get that last barrel or whatever it wants to get, then my own view is I'm fairly agnostic on that. I will say, and I made this clear, I hope, in my comments and in my submissions to you, I have strong concerns about using a more public money towards that in the current context in particular.
Yeah, I guess the thing is I feel here that this would have been the best conversation to have in 1998 to 2022 to be told, well, let us do a massive increase in oil production and I'm sure we're going to find efficiencies. You mentioned the IPCC report. When I read that, the clock is ticking in a serious way. It may already have run out for us, and yet we're talking about an emissions cap that Mr. Guilbeault has now punted off some place into the distant future. You say we need a hard cap. You also say that federally we have the jurisdiction. Why is it that we have the jurisdiction of the federal government to have a hard cap on emissions when we're talking about actually meeting our international obligations? Could you just explain that?
So I'll suggest that it is in part a question of constitutional law. So the sections 91 and 92 have to be interpreted sort of in relation to each other. Parliament has certain heads of legislative power under section 91 and the province is under 92. And when you look at, for instance, the criminal law power, and it clearly can be used to protect the environment, but then we know, for instance, that the provinces have very strong jurisdiction over natural resources, development of natural resources, production falls very squarely in that. I think it's absolutely a reasonable conclusion to say, for Parliament to say, well, our concern, there might be a hypothetical world, maybe in 5 years, we can produce oil and gas and not have emissions. And then we don't need to criminalize the production of oil and gas per se. We criminalize and we prohibit emissions, and we work on reducing emissions, and that's our goal, and that's a valid use of the federal criminal law power. It is not a valid federal use of the criminal law power to micromanage production within the provinces. And and it might seem, I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great, and thanks everybody. Regrettably, we are at the end of our time today, and because the final part of this would be 10 minutes, and that would eat into the time that we need to. Mr. McGuire.
Do we have a couple more minutes just to start another question, or is there a minute each or something? It might be a few questions.
The issue we're going to run into is we have to go out of open and into close, which takes about 5 minutes. Okay. And so I would like to, I think it would be great. But I was going to say that for each of our witnesses who have joined us today, if you have additional thoughts based on the conversation, other thoughts that have come to mind, you are invited to submit a written brief up to 10 pages. And we have had many as part of the study who have built on the conversation that we've had during our time together. And so that invitation extends to each of you. I do want to thank each of you for all of the information you've provided to us today. Lots more for us to consider as we work on our report that we will be hopefully tabling in Parliament soon, and to help the government deal with this very important issue. So thank you to everybody for your participation today. And I'm just going to suspend the meeting. For the members who are online, there's a new link for you to get into the closed session. So we'll be shutting down this part of the meeting, and we invite people to get back in as quickly as possible so we can get going with the in-camera portion of the meeting for committee business. So with that, we'll suspend.
RNNR.